Welcome to the OC24 podcast, where we've taken some of the best talks and discussions from this year's 24-hour conference on global organised crime, which showcases some of the most interesting research into organised crime around the world. This episode is called Human Trafficking in Europe.
Thank you everybody for joining, and for, if you are on this side of the world, for waking up that early to join us. My name is Ruggero, Scaturro, and welcome to panel 13B of the OC24 conference. I'm analyst of the Southeast Europe Observatory of the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime, and today I'm going to be the moderator and also one of the panelists of this session, which is dedicated to exploring various forms of human trafficking that takes place in Europe. It is an honor and a great pleasure as well to introduce my fellow panelists here, starting from Giada Volpato. She's a PhD student at Harper Adams University, where she's studying the intersection between organized crime groups, modern slavery, and agri-horticultural supply chain. Then Silvia Rodriguez-Lopez, lecturer in criminal law at the University of Coruna in Spain, where she recently also presented her PhD thesis on human trafficking-related corruption. And Sara Mariella Lambertini, PhD student in social sciences and statistics at the University Federico II of Naples, where she specializes in transnational organized crime and human trafficking nexuses. To give the audience a little bit of knowledge about the rules of this type of session, we are going now with our presentations. Each panelist will have from 8 to 10 minutes to go through his or her presentation. And then in the meantime, this is, of course, for the audience, use the Q&A box for your questions. And if you have instead thoughts that want to share or comment on anything, please use the chat box. Then, thanks to the help of the Secretariat, then we will collect them. Then we will try at least to address as many as possible. But given the number of participants, I think we encourage you to definitely engage as much as possible and because this is a policy commentary session, so we want to engage in discussion. So it's a very participatory discussion. So it is 9 or 8, and I would definitely, without further ado, give the floor to Giada. And please enlighten us with your presentation. Off you go. And if this, yes, thank you very much for sharing.
So, hello, I'm Giada Volpato, and like Ruggero said, I'm a PhD student at Harper Adams University, where with the help of Dr. Richard Byrne and Cressida Smith, I'm researching and studying how to tackle modern slavery in the European agri-horticultural supply chains. We can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So during my master's dissertation about the reuse of seized and confiscated assets in Italy from organized crime groups, I had the opportunity to interview farmers that work on those lands, and three things stay with me. How in one of the most productive areas for tomato sauce, some farmers wanted to start a gangmaster-free labor, but they soon realized that out of the entire region, only literally 5 or 6 of them could have actually earned this label. And this is because gangmaster is seen as an essential part of farming in some areas of Italy. Also, how farmers were aware the organized crime groups not only control aspects as from whom buy products or sell their goods, but also how organized crime groups control the access to cheap labor that is essential for them. And the third point, complex agri-horticultural supply chain reflect the issue present in Europe, because between farmers and consumers, there is a bottleneck. So we have very few processors, distributors, and retailers of food, and that implies less contractual power for farmers. And at the same time, farmers often are not very aware of the steps beyond selling their products in the supply chain. So not only they are already constricted in a small area, but also they don't have a vision of the entire supply chain. The next slide, please. So when thinking about how to reduce modern slavery, I identified these three main components: organized crime groups, agricultural supply chain in specific, because it's almost a mysterious aspect of agriculture, and modern slavery. The next slide, please. So as per Nicholson et al. In their paper, A Full Freedom, Contemporary Survivors' Definition of Slavery, modern slavery does not have a single agreed upon international definition, but it's like an umbrella term that includes, for example, slavery, servitude, human trafficking, and forced labor. However, the term modern slavery is mostly found and used in the United Kingdom or Australia, or also in Nigeria, so English-speaking country, while human trafficking, forced labor is more used in the European research. Additionally, this is really interesting. In 2010, the European Court of Human Rights addressed the definition of slavery in the case of Rancev versus Cyprus and Russia. And the court concluded that it was unnecessary to identify whether the treatment about which the applicant complains constitutes slavery, servitude, or forced and compulsory labor. So there is clearly a gray area on what term to use and to apply for which situation. And at the same time, we can say the same for organized crime groups. The main feature in the Italian definition for the Article 416 bis are the hierarchical structure, the use of intimidation, and the possible attempt to obstruct free vote. But as per Gomez, Cespedes, and Stangeland, in organized crime control policies in Spain, a disorganized criminal policy for organized crime, they point out how the focus on organized crime in Spain is completely dominated by the debate on terrorism, while the United Nations, again, use a definition that functions as an umbrella term, where the major elements considered are the degree of participation, the number of people involved, and the intention to participate and or the degree of actual participation. This is because mostly in Europe, we consider an organized crime group a group of 3 or more people, but for example, in the Russian legislation, we found 40 or more people. So it's more like a syndicate, like a highly level of organization for the Russia legislation, while in Europe, only 3 people can constitute organized crime groups. So the difference can be explained because of the different legislations, but why do we have different legislations? Because we have different organized crime groups in different territories, and so they have cultural and economic implications in each territory. Again, we found ourselves with not homogeneous views. And regarding laws against labor exploitation, as per Cavana and all, the paper securing the prohibition of labor exploitation in law and practice, Spain prohibits trafficking in human beings, while it does not provide and envisage a crime of slavery unless it occurs within a widespread and systematic attack against the civil population. So we have different names, and different names mean slightly different definition, which mean different policy focus and consequently different policies enacted. So if we can pass to the next slide, please. As a European community, our agriculture supply chain is extremely interdependent. So my question is, what uniform European policy can be enacted to address agricultural supply chain vulnerabilities to forced labor and organized crime? If we can pass to the next one, please. Thank you. So in order to do so, I'm focusing on 3 countries, Italy, Spain, and the United Kingdom. Those 3 countries have been chosen because of their different import and export ratio, the different migration and temporary labor flows, and the established presence of gang mastering. But how are they different and how are they the same? What can we learn from these comparisons? It's also really interesting to note the United Kingdom have a Modern Slavery Act from 2015. Italy addressed the gangmaster problem with a specific law, and Spain also addressed the problem, but with several laws. So the presence of modern slavery, or like most precisely forced labor in agriculture, is established, but try to fight in different ways. So it's really important to establish a way to count the problem, to measure the problem. So if you can pass to the next slide, please. Thank you. So the end goal of this development of a supranational toolkit that highlight issues found during research and gives policy suggestions for improvement. I didn't present any data in this presentation because of COVID. I didn't manage to travel yet. And what I want to do is to interview farmers and small farmers in a remote area. That's my goal, because I found them more connected to the territory. And because of that, I could not met them in person. And if I try to contact them with a meeting or through email, what I receive is a no, I don't know you, I cannot trust you, or I've already been interviewed. So I just recently received a no from a farmer that comes from the north of Africa and lives in Andalusia. And he told me, no, I don't want to meet you or have an interview with you, because I've been interviewed by several researchers or people from other institutions, and nothing changes. So because of this reason, I don't have any data in this presentation, and I'm actually trying to find a new methodology to approach this problem, and in order to collect data that can actually have a reflection on the problems on the territory. So if we can go to the next slide. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Giada. I have already collected a few questions for you, but I also, of course, this said before, for those who have just joined, we are collecting questions, and we want to ask them to the panelists at the very end of all the presentations. So I will then pass to my presentation. Yes, thank you very much. So Modern Slavery Made in Italy is the title of a paper that I have recently published for the Journal of Illicit Economies and Development. And that explores not only the various forms of labor exploitation that occur in the Italian agricultural sector, but also attempts to define, in a way, its enablers, and at the end suggests to some sort of like possible human rights-based approaches and solutions to the phenomenon. So first of all, I thought it would be good to give an understanding of the importance of the Italian agricultural sector and its relevance also at the European level. To give you some data, the annual value of agricultural production in Italy stands at around 57.8 billion euro, and in a cross-country comparison, Italy ranks third among its main EU partners, so after France and Germany, but before Spain. And it actually, in terms of added value, ranks first in 2020, according to data elaborated by Eurostat for 2020. With regards instead to employment, according to most recent estimates, there are roughly 1,060,000 agricultural workers in Italy. And more importantly, 90% of this 1 million plus of the workforce is seasonal, is short term. And out of this, in absolute terms, is around 400,000, so pretty much 48% are migrant workers that come from more than 120 countries, but mainly from Romania, Morocco, South Asia, so India, Bangladesh, and Pakistan, Albania, Poland, Bulgaria, and Tunisia. Now, according to data which is elaborated by the Osservatorio Placido Rizzotto, which is an observatory of one of the biggest Italian trade union, the CGIL, there are around 100,000 migrant farm workers in Italy that are hired within caporalato schemes, and they are subject to forms of labor exploitation that vary from inadequate housing, when, of course, in relation to the work in the fields, to lack of access to potable water and extremely long working shifts, so up to 12, 13 hours with no breaks whatsoever. But then the question is, what is caporalato? Well, it is just the Italian term for an exploitative system of recruitment practices that disproportionately affect migrant workers, and which often lead to forced and bonded labor situations. However, in Italy, instead of the caporalato phenomenon and labor exploitation in general, instead of being included in the human trafficking discourse, it's been traditionally associated by law enforcement authorities, local courts, judges, but also in general, the media, I would say, the general narrative on the topic, with the presence of organized crime in the territory. However, as you can see in the map where I have tried to place different cases that have been prosecuted since 2016, 166 cases of forced labor in agriculture. As you can see, and also here I've tried to also include the major, the areas of origin and major influence of Italian traditional organized crime groups. The phenomenon of illegal recruitment is rather widespread across the country, and has no, I would argue, at least not direct association with traditional Italian mafia presence and practices in this phenomenon. In fact, there are roughly 25% of small and medium-sized enterprise, mostly in agricultural sector, that benefit from illegal recruitment practices. And in absolute terms, we're talking about 30,000 companies that use such services. So here I have tried to summarize some of the many, of course, there's many more enablers of the phenomenon of the such illegal recruitment practices in a sort of like supply and demands framework. On the supply side here, I put the wage differentials between Italy and low-income countries of migrant origins. So for some migrants, especially those that benefit from a rather high degree of freedom of movement, so I'm referring here to migrants coming mostly from Romania, Bulgaria, and Poland, so a member of the European Union, it is still perceived, at least, to be very attractive. It is attractive to still come to Italy, accumulate as much money as possible, being exposed to forced labor, or at least labor exploitation, but at least accumulate as much money as possible and then go back to their own country, because of course you're talking about seasonal work, where they can still enjoy a rather higher purchasing power. Then another attractive factor, I would say, is represented by this low bureaucratic process to obtaining visas and working permits in Italy. Italy has to be understood that the public sector is very slow in guaranteeing and in granting visas. So this leads migrants in a way to live in a sort of limbo where they cannot really find a legit source of income. This applies mostly also to migrants that are been staying in Italy already for a long while, India mostly, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and that in a way rely on the informal networks to guarantee some sort of income, because going to the police and exposing certain practices, so illegal recruitment, would then actually put themselves at risk of expulsion. And then here, I wanted to also put geographical proximity. This, of course, apply only to certain migrants. For example, Balkan Peninsula, migrants coming from Albania, or depending, of course, on the side of Italy, also North Africa, mostly Tunisians arriving to Sicily. It is rather easy to access also for geographical proximity to Italian territory. Regarding the other side, so the demand side, there are many more factors as just these three. I just here try to be as brief as possible. The big prevalence definitely of small and medium-sized enterprises with very low mechanizations levels in a way require high levels of manpower. Italians see working, of course, in agriculture sector as a non-remunerative and very heavy job. So, and they tend not to work anymore, at least in the agricultural sector. So, in this gap, in a way, is filled by migrant workforce. Then another item here is the presence of a buyer-driven agri-food supply chain. In here, I wanted to simply highlight the fact that most times small and medium-sized enterprises are left with very small margins of maneuver when it comes to profit. This is definitely not a justification to lower wages and to exploit workers, but it's definitely a contributory factor. And then I also wanted to put some sort of like historical perspective regarding the history of informal economy. Italy has been, it's traditionally, the informal economy in Italy is traditionally strong, and especially in certain sectors, and agriculture is one of those. Regarding the legal framework here, I will go rather fast because my colleagues are definitely gonna talk more about these aspects. But in general, so Italy has ratified most ILO conventions, with the exception of the 1949 revised Migrant Workers Convention. It is a member of GI-TOC when it comes to the nexus between human trafficking in general here and forced labor and organized crime. Also access the human trafficking and human smuggling protocols. At the regional level, it has signed the Council of Europe Convention on Migrant Workers, and as being a European Union member, is also subject to its directive and regulation on the matter. But more importantly, in 2016, the Parliament has passed a new law which updates the content of Article 603 bis of the Penal Code, that punishes not only who directly hire the workers in an illegal manner, and exploit them, so the caporali, the gang masters, but also who indirectly benefit from such malpractices. This means that if the executives or the owners of the enterprises of the small and medium-sized companies, even at the time of hiring such migrants, didn't know about these practices, they still might face imprisonment and fines as well. However, in my paper, I argue that what Italy has definitely missed is the opportunity to look at the issue not only from a criminal law perspective, so not only just from a repression and prosecution perspective, but also from a prevention one, so also from a more victim-oriented perspective. And this could have been possible definitely, not only, but definitely also by signing and ratifying the Convention on the Rights of the Migrants and Workers and their families. The convention is, in fact, most likely the only international human rights instrument which puts the migrants at the center and sets minimum standard of the protection, but also promotion of the rights to health, for example, to housing, to education, to social inclusion, and not only to them, but also extend these rights to the members of the families, which are often forgotten. In this sense, I argue that, at least in my paper, that Italy has definitely missed an opportunity to harmonize not only its legislation, but also its general approach and hold I would say the whole narrative on the matter, on the topic. Next slide. Yeah, this is my last slide. This pretty much summarizes what's been said so far. It's in this graphs I've tried. You can see here on the left the supply side, and then on the right in red you can see the demand. And also the basis is this triangle is all the different layers of the public approach. For example, the absence of a human rights-based approach, the focus on the organized crime factor, focus on repression rather than prevention. So this is meant to depict a situation in Italy which really doesn't, which is functioning because the system functions, but definitely to the detriment of migrant workers' rights. And this was my last presentation. And Silvia, off you go.
Okay, thank you very much. What I would like to share with you today is, are actually some preliminary results of a piece of research I'm carrying out on the links between human trafficking and organized crime in Spain using case law. Next slide, please. Sorry, I was trying to pause it myself. As you all know, concerns about human trafficking re-emerged in the 1990s in this context of increasing globalization, interdependent economic systems, and mobility across borders. So in this context, human trafficking was considered part of a global process of securitization and a process that emphasized this role of organized crime as a threat to international security. So from this moment, human trafficking has been linked to organized crime, not only in criminal justice policies and legislation, like, for example, the Palermo Protocol, which is part of the Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime, but also in criminological studies. So it has been assumed that human trafficking is always committed by very complex organized criminal groups who use very violent means and obtain huge profits out of trafficking. However, some recent empirical studies have begun to question this statement, and they show that traffickers are usually trafficked persons, relatives, friends who work in small groups or individually, but not necessarily in this traditional or stereotypical organized criminal groups. So basically, in my study, I would like to have a look at what's happening in Spain and answer the following two questions. So to what extent is human trafficking linked to organized crime in Spain? And what are the characteristics of organized criminal groups involved in human trafficking in Spain? To do so, next slide, please. To do so, I basically used 55 judgments, so all the judgments I could collect, in which at least one of the defendants was convicted of human trafficking in Spain between 2015 and 2019. I have to say that all these cases were sex trafficking cases because the number of labor trafficking cases that reach court is very, very, very limited. These 55 cases were scrutinized in order to find data related to the following aspects. So the first one was the percentage of human trafficking cases in which, according to the courts, OCGs were involved. And the second one were the characteristics of these groups. In order to systematize the analysis, I focused on 4 aspects, which correspond to the 4 essential elements of the definition of human trafficking in Spain, which Giada has already mentioned a bit. An organized criminal group, according to Spanish legislation, only requires 2 traffickers, more than 2 traffickers, division of tasks, hierarchical structure, and the aim of committing crimes, in this case, human trafficking. Right, so next slide, please. So according to Spanish criminal law, if the person who commits human trafficking belongs or leads an organized criminal group, they should be punished for an aggravated form of trafficking. And this aggravated form of trafficking was applied just in 10 out of the 55 analyzed cases, so which amounts to 18% of all cases. So the first idea that comes to our minds when we see this is the following. Okay. This is because it couldn't be proved. The courts could not demonstrate that the links to organized crime. So I took into account all those cases in which possible involvement of organized crime was included, even though in the end it could not be demonstrated. And the percentage is not much higher. If we have a look at the next slide, please. The percentage is not much higher, so it involves just 27% of all cases. Regarding the characteristics of these groups, next slide, please. The first aspect analyzed was the composition of the criminal group. So according to the information given by the courts, the groups were very small. They were formed by 2 to 6 people. Although it is true that sometimes the courts mentioned the possibility that there were other members, but they couldn't be found, identified, or prosecuted. Interestingly, they were all migrants as well. They were people from Nigeria, Romania, Bulgaria, and China. The courts often or almost always described these organized criminal groups as family organizations or family clans. And just one case is different, which is the case of the famous Nigerian Supreme Eye Confraternity, which is the only one that fits this stereotypical image of an organized criminal group. This group, according to the information provided by the judges, was formed in the 1960s. It was originally a student organization and then somehow grew and expanded across borders and started to engage in migration and crimes related to migration. And they follow this stereotypical image of an organized criminal group because they had their own symbols, slogans, initiation rites, and they, according to the sentence, the members would call each other lords or air lords and would have a specific way of greeting each other. So it fits more with this stereotypical idea of organized crime. The second characteristic, next slide, please, was actually the division of tasks, so how these OCGs operate. The division of tasks usually coincides with the different stages of the trafficking process. Normally, the leaders of the organization or their relatives in the country of origin, because they're closer to the victims, would be the ones who are in charge of recruitment. These people, the relatives who are in the country of origin, are usually the ones in charge of transportation or accompany the victims to in their journeys. Receipt and harboring and surveillance and control is usually performed by low-ranking members of the group who are also migrant, sometimes previous victims or victims at the moment, who live with the victims and are closer to them to take their passports away and identity documents away. The third characteristic is the hierarchical structure. Practically all groups represent a more or less hierarchical structure. The only one that presents a rigid hierarchical structure is this Nigerian confraternity, where, according to the courts, there is a general officer commanding, which manages the whole process of trafficking. According to the information provided by the courts, all generally groups leaders are convicted, although it is true that they sometimes mention the possibility that other leaders could not be identified and prosecuted. And finally, the last characteristic is the aim of committing crimes. Almost all cases, in fact, all cases but one, are just involved in human trafficking for the purposes of sexual exploitation. So they do not engage in other criminal activities. It is true that some of them were convicted for related crimes, such as facilitation of illegal migration, forced prostitution, but they are all related to human trafficking. And it is also very interesting that the sentences often state that human trafficking was the perpetrator's only way of making a living, and that they would send all the money that they would make out of trafficking and exploitation to their families back in the countries of origin. So, and this leads to the conclusions. Which is the last slide, please. So basically, this study shows that the percentage of convicted or alleged trafficking cases in which organized criminal groups were involved is lower than 30%. And this leads to two questions that I leave open for discussion, which are, or two possibilities, or two explanations for this, which are maybe not all cases are identified and prosecuted. Or another possibility is that perhaps OCG's involvement in human trafficking has been overestimated. Regarding the characteristics of the organized criminal groups, they do not fit this stereotypical idea of an organized criminal group. They are usually very small. They don't need to use violence because they are usually relatives or acquaintances of the victims and also between each other. They are, of course, coordinated by a leader because of the complexities of the trafficking process, and they are solely dedicated to human trafficking. They're not dedicated to various criminal activities. So overall, this leads to a final idea, which is the need to get to know trafficking perpetrators better, so that anti-trafficking policies are more suited to the criminological reality. And that's it. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Silvia. Very interesting. I have a couple of comments, especially for the last two questions that you left for us. I think is very interesting also from a comparative perspective to see also the different approaches also that within European Union law enforcement authorities have to the phenomenon. But without further ado, I would definitely leave the floor to Sara for our last presentation, and then after hers, we can definitely open for the debate.
Well, this is part of my PhD research about international organized crime and sexual exploitation in Italy. I will present a brief description of the phenomenon and the legal framework in Italy to contrast it. At the end, I will put some recommendations. Okay, what are the context? Sexual exploitation remains a significant problem in Europe. 16% of the victims are sexually exploited, more than a half of whom are European citizens, and most of them are women. Unfortunately, the fight against human trafficking can increase the vulnerability of migrants because often legitimized policies and repressive interventions trigger migrants to face jobs in conditions of clandestinity and exploitation. The long-standing presence in Europe has provided criminal organizations with an understanding of the mechanisms of law enforcement and asylum. These situations allow us to use legal institutions for the movement of affiliates and victims. Network of traffickers are showing ever higher level of professionalism and competence. Organized crime groups involved in human trafficking have established well-structured criminal networks operated internationally. Criminal organizations centered in human trafficking and so home interdependent, providing everything needed for the transfer of migrants from the country of origin to the country of destination. Next slide, please. In Italy, human trafficking is a phenomenon linked to immigration, being a destination country for people who are victims of trafficking, who also a transit country to other destinations in Europe. Most of the victims of trafficking destined for Europe, and in particular to Italy, continue to come from European countries. However, the exponentially growing number of victims from the African continent has become to the attention of the Italian authorities, especially women from Nigeria. Since 1995, Italian authorities have highlighted the increase of trafficking in persons for purpose of sexual exploitation. Albanian and Nigerian criminal organizations are very active in that, showing a growing prevalence of the territory and a greater organizational capacity. On the other hand, these criminal groups collaborate with Italian criminal organizations. In some cases, the relation is a suggestion. However, they are looking for a progressive autonomy, especially in sexual exploitation. Next slide, please. So, how Italy addressed this situation? Italy fights the exploitation of human beings without limiting itself to trafficking of human beings or crimes of slavery. The Italian legal framework is extensive, so I will focus the attention in some norms. At the beginning, the Constitution of the Italian Republic recognizes and guarantees in Article 2 the inviolability of human rights without distinguishing people according to their status or as a citizen or migrant. Since 1958, there is a law to combat the sexual exploitation known as Merlin Law. Articles 3 and 4 of Merlin Law combat interprostitution, and anyone who recruits or induces a person to engage in prostitution or facilitate it. However, Chinese criminal groups are very active in their prostitution in Italy using the massage saloon, as well as the Nigerian criminal organization that controls connection houses in some part of Italy. Another relevant norm is the legislative decree 286, in Italy, like el Testo Único sull'Immigrazione. Its Article 18 establishes a humanitarian permit for social protection reasons, considered a model in terms of protection and support of persons involved in situations of trafficking or a serious exploitation. But not everything is protection. The Decree Law 113, known as Salvini Decree, repealed the residence permit on humanitarian grounds that was recognized to most potential victims of trafficking, leaving them in a situation of irregularity. In place of human protection, the law introduced a special residence permit for victims of domestic violence or serious labor exploitation. People in urgent need of medical care, persons from a country which is a temporary situation of natural disaster, and persons who are performing acts of high civic value. Regarding the regulatory framework, It's relevant to observe all the changes introduced to the penal code in Italy. The Italian legislature condemns the reduction or retention in slavery or servitude of a person, referring to the state of continuous subjection, to compel it to work of sexual services, begging, to carry out illegal activity, or to submit to the removal of organs. Another relevant documents are the guidelines to the Territorial Commission for the Recognition of International Protection. These guidelines provide a standard operating procedure, including a step-by-step explanation of the process, with charts, indicators, practical tips on how to perform interviews and other things. And finally, the National Action Plans Against Trafficking and Serious Exploitation, adopted in 2016. The plan is structured according to the 4 guidelines of the European Union, that is prevention, persecution, protection, and partnership. So the conclusions and recommendations. Although Italy's legal framework has been recognized as advanced at the international level, its implementations have not always been sufficiently effective, and has attracted some criticism. In the first place, the focus on the criminal organizations and not in the victims. Italian police authorities tend to focus in identify and combating criminal organizations. This Machiavellian organization dedicated to human trafficking has a greater weight than pointing to individual responsibility. However, this position leaves potential victims of trafficking unprotected. Another critique is the implementation of Article 18 del Testo Único sulle Immigrazione. Because in theory, it's possible to obtain a permit for social protection reasons without the victim obligation to report the traffickers. Despite this, in practice, the cooperation with the authorities is prioritized to grant the protection. So several victims remain without protection because they don't know what are the traffickers, or they can identify these traffickers. Another situation is the prosecution for other crimes and not for trafficking human beings. Sometimes, to the lack of evidence to prove human trafficking, the Italian authorities put the focus on prosecution of other crimes, for example, reducing or keeping a person in slavery or servitude. This situation does not allow to know the real magnitude of the phenomenon. It also prevents victims of trafficking from being recognized as such, limiting the benefits to which they are entitled. So there are some recommendations. See the society as part of the phenomenon and the solution. In this sense, reduce the demand that fosters all forms of exploitation related to trafficking in human beings is crucial, in particular for sexual exploitation. 2, increase the coordination within NGOs and Italian authorities, particularly for identification of the victims, to ensuring them protection and assistance. The non-identification of victims prevents its access to basic rights and facilitates impunity. At the end, a new national plan against trafficking and serious exploitation that must attend the new UN strategy, particularly in regard to the identification and protection of the victim, as well as the prevention.
Thank you very much. I haven't seen any question in the box. So in case anybody from the audience wants, please do not hesitate. But as I don't see any, I will definitely first ask our panelists, so Silvia, Giada, and Sara, if you have, first of all, any questions to any of us. Giada?
Yes, I actually have a question for Silvia. So do you, I don't know if it's something that I can actually ask, but do you personally think the phenomenon is bigger than what you saw in Spain? Because actually I've seen the same numbers in Italy, Spain, and the UK, where the end of the process where almost every time okay, so the prosecutors acquitted, while in reality the victims knew that they were forced to work or that they were trafficked, but because of some I don't know, legal tricks like in human trafficking, if at any time you said you don't want to move, you are a trafficked person. So you are now migrate, you are trafficked. And sometimes people can use that as a trick to not being exploiters. do you feel like it's the same in the cases you saw?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for your question, Giada. I take you're referring to the whole human trafficking phenomenon, not just what the specifically focused on organized crime. Yes, I definitely agree. I think around Europe, we all, or almost all countries, have the same problem, like the problems to identify victims and problems to prosecute traffickers, but more importantly, problems to identify victims. When it comes to prosecuting traffickers, because that's what you were asking, I think you were mentioning some legal tricks. I think one of the possible legal tricks might be the way deception is understood. Because some courts considered that for deception to be there, you need to be completely wrong about what you're going to do in the country of origin. What I mean is, you were offered a job as a waitress and you ended up being a prostitute or a sex worker. So that would be considered deception. And they do not see deception when you are going to work, I don't know, harvesting garlic or strawberries, and you know what your activity is going to be, but you were deceived about the conditions. And they say, oh, well, you knew what you were going to do, therefore you cannot be a victim of human trafficking, even though the conditions were exploitative. That would be one of the reasons, among many others. And then the other one has to do with the way human trafficking is legally constructed, because in Spanish criminal law, as in many other European legislations, it is constructed as a process towards exploitation, but not exploitation itself. So very, very often, it is not possible to prove the whole process. So the fact that they were recruited, they were moved to other place, and what you can prove is just exploitation. And when you can just prove exploitation, you don't apply human trafficking, you apply another crime. And as you know, in Spain, we don't have a crime of forced labor. And slavery, just if it's in the context of a war. So that's why there aren't that many human trafficking cases, because you use other crimes instead.
Thank you very much. Sara, do you so you muted yourself?
Yes, no, it's very interesting, the things that Silvia noted, because in Italy it's something like that, because you can prove all the process, you can prove that you were trafficked, but what are the name of the traffickers? Is an organization or not? So when you arrive here, it's very complicated for these victims or potential victims. And the end, the Italian authorities use another article of the penal code as a slavery, or yes, the exploitation, but it's not human trafficking. That is, for that reason, you can see all the magnitude of the phenomenon in reality, because when you see the figures, it's not so huge.
Can I add one last thing, if that's okay?
Please.
So the Palermo Protocol provides with 3 facts: means, purpose, and action. But it's really interesting, if I remember correctly, because but it's interesting because in the United Kingdom referral mechanism, the means is not included. So you don't need to have a mean to be how can I say, a victim of modern slavery, of human traffic, or forced labor. So that change on definition is what really is flabbergasting me about everything, because you just need to change a comma and you change the view, completely the view of how you see the victim. But even in the British legislation, sometimes the victims are prosecuted. And I just studied a case where 2 South Asian, I think, forced labor, they were working in a cannabis farm, and they have been prosecuted for a longer term than the 2 British people that were actually keeping them working there. in incredible, awful conditions. So even if the legislation provides you with all the tools, sometimes it's really interesting to see how they're not used or they are misused. So yeah.
We have a question from the chat. So Joanna writes here that she would be interested in knowing if any of us know how law enforcement authority investigations work in the EU between the countries of origin and country of destination. I would partially try to address this question, and then of course I would leave it to especially the three of you. Of course, at the international level and the EU level, GI-TOC definitely works as a platform for exchange and international cooperation on matters of regarding the mandate, of course, of the convention. But also, what I have been observing lately, especially when it comes to certain matters, what is essential is the enrichment of bilateral agreements between states. This is something that, of course, the GI-TOC is general. It is a platform. It works. But when it comes to specific cases, specific dynamics, such as, for example, human trafficking from specific West African countries, or like in, say, Nigeria, Edo State, especially Nigeria, going to Italy, it is essential that Italian law enforcement have at least MOU with local authorities of the country of origin. So at the legal level, this is definitely important. Speaking of experience, in another important, because as I said before, I work for the Southeast Europe Observatory of GI-TOC, covering mostly the Western Balkan 6. When it comes to, for example, the drugs market, it's very unrelated, but gives still an idea. It is essential, for example, in the fight against cannabis cultivation, especially, and cannabis traffic between Albania and Italy, that Italy has a very strong collaboration, not only with law enforcement authorities from Albania, but also from other actors, meaning also collaborations at the civil society level. So it is the whole apparatus that has to move in a way to meet the other side needs, and this can be done, legally speaking, only through bilateral international agreements. Okay, we have another question. I think this is more for Giada and myself. What do we think businesses themselves, so the companies, could do to prevent labor exploitation in agriculture?
So from my side, there is lots has been done. So there is a Modern Slavery Act in the UK, and all the big companies have to provide with what they do in order to prevent this, but it's really hard. So if we think about Sainsbury's, Amazon, all big corporations, it's clear that they cannot control every single step of the supply chain, especially when we all know the agriculture is not highly mechanized. So, and you have so many gray areas in agriculture where you can force people to work for 15 hours a day for €5. So I think it's more like a local kind of control. So in the cocoa supply chain, so much has been done, and you can actually almost track every single step, even if there is there is a need of improvement, of course. But I think that's the solution. So involve farmers, because like I said in the presentation, so many times they really think local, and they only see their little garden. They don't see the other steps. I think that's what we can do. So work on a local base, and yeah.
I second totally that, and also to add on your point, especially in the Italian context, as you said, and also in the presentation said before, the entrepreneurial fabric of Italy is is mostly, if not totally, composed by small and medium-sized enterprises. We are talking about family-run businesses. And given also the hard times that they always say that they live, it is very important, at least from my very perspective, to sort of like incentivize this. And given that we are talking about businesses, I believe that it is very important to sort of like, at least for the institutions, to show the fact that, or at least try to come up with a system that from which small and medium-sized enterprises can economically benefit from. It is very important to give small and medium-sized, the owners, executives, white collars, or the owners, and the understanding that if you don't exploit, you benefit, because it is more taxes, it is less, more revenues and less taxes, etc., 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 for the whole system. Of course, it is very hard though to because it's not in the short term. Is definitely not an easy task. But I would say that the economic component, given that we're talking about businesses, it's always central. It's always central, because you cannot go to the business and say, you shouldn't do this because you violate the right of these people. It's because they will always have another answer to that. They say, no, actually with him is different. I treat him in this way. It's okay. This is still because he likes what he does, etc., etc., etc. So these are some of the aspects that I would definitely keep into consideration when addressing at least possible local oriented solution. Yeah, definitely. We just have 14 minutes now. If it's okay, I would like to ask a question to Giada. You were talking about, I don't know the nationality, but anyways, there was a farmer that you reached out and he said that he wasn't really willing to talk to you. And then you were also because of COVID, you were also trying to find alternative ways to conduct your research. And my question is, given the high level of informality of the networks as well, social networks in general, I was my question, my suggestion, or rather than question, is: have you tried with community leaders of certain communities? So, and then my question related to that is, how much is it important to establish this sort of like communication channel with people that matters? It can be the imam. It can be the also like spiritual or whatever community leaders in general.
So I didn't imagine the PR would have been a task on my research, but you are absolutely right. And also after researching, I saw how many religious organizations work with forced labor and immigrants, because of course a case in the UK, a person was working in a house as a cleaner, and the only way for her to go out was to go to church. So the priest was the one that discovered that case of slavery. So working with religious imam, priest, authorities in general is really important. But at the same time, even if I establish so far contact with them, then it's really hard to do the next step. So to have an interview or even just a chat with someone that had experience on that, because they are always scared of repercussions, scared of their name being published. So it's really, really hard. And in Scotland, I had a meeting with Priest Just Help people from Nigeria. They were moved to the north of Scotland to work with the oil companies, and actually they were also in that case just used to other kind of works. But even in that case, so far from home, no connections whatsoever, they were not willing to talk to me. So yeah, I think in my case, my methodology will have to improve this next step in order to have some real voices. That's what I really want to. Don't just study previous researches like I'm doing right now because of the legislation, but to have real voices, and in order to prove real improvements. So yeah, I think I just need to understand how to do the next step. That I think is the same when you work with people that are sexual workers. I think is the same. How do you do that, if I can ask? How can you engage with them? Sara, sorry. I took it for granted.
The answer. But it's very complicated, yes, because it's a traumatic situation, not only for the sexual exploitation. In fact, I studied the Nigerian community here in Naples, in Campania, And it's complicated for the people that beg in the street and everything, because they don't want to talk about the experience. So it's very complicated. You have to create this relation that it took months, almost years. In fact, for my PhD research, will be a very hard part of my research, because when I answer something, so when I made some questions about, for example, the affiliation rituals, the juju, and things, almost the people is like, I don't want to talk about that. At the beginning, put like a wall or change the subject. Yes, you have to work like I say day after day or month, yes, to give an answer. But we have to do it because it's the unique form to understand all the phenomena.
I have actually still another question for Sara. You at the very end of the presentation, you one of the recommendations is reduce the demand. I don't know how you mean it. I don't know. I don't have statistics. Also, I don't have numbers in terms of how many Italians, for example, in our case, go and uses sexual services. But then my question in this sense would be, and also if there's also any data in terms of age, gender, and in terms also nationality of the sexual workers, which are preferred. These are all data which is super interesting. But anyways, my question is, do you believe that the legalization of sex work would help in that sense, adopting the German, Austrian model? Do you believe that taxation would help in that sense? Also, in a way, because you know Italy, of course, and it's very taboo to open up about this discussion in terms with the public, the presence of the Vatican, etc., etc. But would you consider this as an option in order to reduce the demand, or at least to not to reduce, but at least to regulate it?
Yes, thank you for your question. It's very complicated, yes, because Italy have this taboo that they don't want to talk about this. But when you see all the reports of for example, the National Direction about international crime and all the reports about that, it's very hard to believe. The age of the sexual exploitation girls is year reduced. They are basically teenagers. The most of the victims are teenagers. Then when I arrived to Italy, the people to pay for this sex are black, are white men, are younger than not teenagers, but in 20s to 60 years, it's something like that. And if I believe that to regulate the prostitution in Italy could help with this one, I don't know, because some statistics said that, for example, the models that used, for example, in Sweden to punish the people who buy the sex, basically, is not so good, because at the end, you don't reduce the demand. You only like put it in a closed place. The legalization of the prostitution is very complicated here, not only for the situation, the religion situation, only for the part of the feminism, because at the end, prostitution is considered a foreign exploitation from the masculine society, no? So I don't think it will be helped. I think it's better to work with the society to create not only for the sexual exploitation, for exploitation in general. You have to put the attention in the society to understand the phenomenon. You have to educate the population to understand that these girls are not here for the voluntary and don't do this for that. I think it's better work in that direction and not to legalize the prostitution. It would be my answer.
Thank you very much. We still have 4 minutes, so 3.5. We have a question. One second here. So if we have data on children trafficking in Europe, if it's common as a common other types of trafficking in person, I would definitely suggest you. I'm gonna now share in the chat box the link to a report that I have co-authored for the global initiative, our Southeast Europe Observatory, on children and in general juvenile commercial sexual exploitation in the Western Balkan 6. We have collected data for the Western Balkan 6, although and also taking into consideration minorities, so especially Roma community, but also children on the move, especially Afghani and mostly Afghani kids in migration reception centers across the Western Balkans. I'm gonna now share the link in the chat. You can definitely have a look. It is interesting because it not only explores the phenomenon, but it also, in a way, analyzes the legal responses to it. And I encourage you to also have a look at that. I personally we didn't have any data specifically on European Union, but we have, for example, highlighted a few cases on Western Balkan networks, especially from Bosnia, in Western Europe, when it came to juvenile and especially the human trafficking of young Romanian and Bosnian women to Paris. It was a very well-functioning criminal network, which was dismantled by an operation led by Europol, Bosnian, French, and the German authorities. I can see, so one last question. If I see in Italy or Spain emerging of human smuggling and trafficking, this is definitely a big question. There are certain instances, of course, of I would say merging when it comes to, for example, the Central Mediterranean route. But we definitely do not have time. I'm sorry, because it's a very interesting question. Because also from a legal perspective, I see Silvia that keeps saying yeses, and but yeah, I would definitely ask you to, if you are interested in exploring these topics with any of us, please reach out also bilaterally and privately. You have in the webpage of the OC24 in our panel specifically, you have access to our contacts. If you have shared us, I don't know, but yeah, we should all be able to reach us in case you have other further questions to ask us. And it is 1 minute to the end. I would thank very much Silvia, Giada, and Sara. If you want to have a final word, and from my side, it's all.
Just thank you, because it was really, really interesting. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for sharing, and of course, thank you to everyone who was listening.
Thank you very much, and I hope you will enjoy the rest of the conference with other panels. I'm sure there is lots of insights from other sessions. And I will wrap it up now. Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to the OC24 podcast. For more talks, have a look at the podcast feed on whichever platform you use. There are loads more to listen to. Video versions of these talks are also available on the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organised Crime YouTube channel. If you would like to share these talks around, we ask that you use the hashtag OC24 and let us know what you think. The 24-hour conference on global organised crime is brought to you by the European Consortium of Political Research Standing Group on Organised Crime, the Centre for Information and Research on Organised Crime, the International Association for the Study of Organised Crime, and the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organised Crime. For more information, head over to oc24.globalinitiative.net. This has been the OC24 podcast from the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organised Crime. Thanks for listening.